My name is Naya Harris. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out to Ask an Indigenous Person. This, as Kathy and Sherry just mentioned, this is the last one that will be hosted or moderated by me. Oh, hi. It's kind of bittersweet. When this was advertised a couple months back that we were going to do this panel, we did say this is the 11th and final installment. And I think after Sherry hosted Ask a Refugee in September, she might have got bit by the moderating bug. And she said, I think we should continue this. And so Sherry will be taking over. So I'm really excited that the program will continue. I'm going to just have you guys go down the line here and just quick introduce yourselves, and then we'll go ahead and get started and jump into the questions. We're going to share a mic at the end of this table, and then Donald and Micah, if you wouldn't mind sharing a mic on your end.
Hello, my name is Dana Thompson. I live here in Roseville. My family is from the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. Paralegal supervisor, 27 years old. Don't know what else you guys want to know, but feel free to ask. Oh, and Naya here wants me to say that I ran for city council in this last election here in Roseville. I didn't win, but I did really good, so maybe something again in the future.
Nice, right on. Yes, right on. Thanks, Dan. My name is Gary Lussier. Red Lake, Chippewa. Educator all my life, and literally started out as a hall monitor, and worked my way up to be a principal, and it was quite a career. I should tell you that my wife has given me permission to look into retirement this year, so that's kind of hopeful. But I am right now. I'm a teacher. I went back after retiring from being a principal and started teaching. So I teach American Indian students. I go to 16 different sites, and I teach Ojibwe and Dakota language and culture. And so to engage them at middle school in order to hopefully they will stay in school.
Hi everyone, my name is Allison Waka. I am Menominee and Navajo, and I currently work at Hennepin County Libraries.
Good evening. I'm Don Eubanks. And I'll just mention that Gary and I go back to the projects in North Minneapolis. So we've known each other since we were kids. Um, I currently am faculty at Metropolitan State University in the School of Social Work. I'm an enrolled member of the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, born and raised in Minneapolis. Um, what can I say? And I was 2 times Commissioner of Health and Human Services for the Mille Lacs Band. I worked for Marge Anderson when she was tribal chair. And in between those stints, I was uh, director of chemical health for Department of Human Services, which I think some of you remember because I recognize some of your faces when we did the Race to the Power of an Illusion in here last year.
Hi everyone, I'm Micah Standing Soldier. I am Oglala Lakota from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. I'm currently pursuing a career in the legal field. I'm also the founder of a tech startup, which is the most millennial thing ever. And I'm also a poet in the Twin Cities.
Just to reiterate, so you're going to share a mic on the end, just so we don't have to wait. Just really quick housekeeping items. Please take a minute and silence your cell phone. I heard one already. It never fails. It doesn't matter how many times you mention it. Somebody's phone's always going off. Please take a moment to silence or vibrate set your phone to vibrate, please. Thank you so much. Couple other reminders. Please be respectful. Seems like common sense, but just be respectful. And part of that is, please don't blurt out. This is being recorded by CTV. Hi, John. They have been our partner for most of this series. I think we only have 2 that haven't been recorded. So if you've missed the other ones, go check them out. And huge thank you to Tim Domke for believing in us, believing in this vision and recording this series. Also, while I'm thanking people, a quick shout out to Carol Jackson, who is not here tonight, but is instrumental in this program being in this space, and for her just believing in us. Let me see. I think that's kind of it. So sit back, relax for the next 90 minutes here. We're going to dive right into the questions and let our panelists answer. And I guess without further ado, is everybody ready? Deep breath. I already have a couple of my own questions. It looks like some questions are coming in from the audience as well. I want to start with this question. This won't come as a shock to any of you. I think I already mentioned I was going to ask this question, but when it comes to terms, what term is preferred? Native American, American Indian, Indigenous? What term do you prefer? And I guess we'll start there. Who'd like to take that one? No, not everybody raise their hand at once.
I'll just start, I guess. So for me, this question is really about personal preference, and something that I've kind of learned along my road of trying to discover who I am is that I prefer to be called Indigenous. When people say Native or Native American, it's indicative of this land being American before Americans were actually here. And since we were here before colonization, I think Indigenous is the best noun to use in that circumstance. So that's my preference.
Thank you, Dan. So when I introduced myself, I said Red Lake Chippewa. And so a lot of times people will think, well, Chippewa, that's kind of not the real term. Isn't the term Ojibwe? And so people have you've heard that too, I'm hope. But when we speak about ourselves in our language, we say Anishinaabe, which is in our language. Um, the I should tell you probably the answer to that question for me is really that I'm kind of a very open about that, and I'm not so bothered. Of course, it's because of age. I think that just kind of mellowed out. And so personally, I didn't mention after listening to Micah. I thought, well, I should mention that I'm also Lakota. My mother is Lakota. My father is Ojibwe, and so that's kind of a key thing for me and throughout my life. So I'm just open about. You can say Indian or it's kind of. I have a colleague who spells it NDN, which is just Indian, and that comes from Canada or First Nation people. So it's all pretty cool to me.
Oh, this is our mic. Sorry. So I guess he handed it to me. I can go ahead and say my opinion, I guess. I go back and forth. So when I was growing up in the school system, then it was American Indian, and then it went back to Native American, and um, I was always just happy when people knew if I was. I guess my thing is I have always gotten labeled Hispanic or Latino, and so when they know I'm American Indian or Native American, it just makes me feel a lot better. But now, in like I want to say in like the last 10 years, it's become like a kind of a transition um, where I do. T- I speak when I speak to someone else that's Native, I'll say, "Oh, they're Native," but then I feel weird when a non-Native person calls me Native. So it's more like a term I think that I prefer to use among other Natives. And then for Indigenous, I have a hard time sometimes with that because there's Indigenous people all over the world, and so when you say Indigenous, it's not wrong, but it's inclusive of everyone that's Indigenous. So it's really hard to kind of narrow it down to perhaps when I'm in my work too, it's more with a particular nation. And so I've just found that it's really the most respectful to find out someone's actual nation. So I really have started to prefer people to call me Menominee or Navajo, and kind of dig deeper, I guess, into instead of just kind of generalizing my nation.
Testing. Okay. Well, I guess for me, there's nothing more that I could add to what's already been said. other than I'm biracial. My father was African American. So very seldom people ever identified me as being Indian. So I very seldom get asked that question. And then when I self identify myself, um, then people just look at me with surprisement. Um, so usually I tell them I'm Puerto Rican or something. But so my feeling about that is the same as everyone else. When we introduce ourselves, so I'm Anishinaabe, and so that's how we self-identify among ourselves, and and then a lot of us have names, Indian names, and I very seldom use my name unless I'm in the proper company, and but that's another story.
So I think one of the things that it's kind of common amongst all of us is that we all have differing opinions on what we prefer to be called. I will say a distinction for me is that if you're talking amongst fellow non-native people, it doesn't really matter what you're saying because we can't hear it, unless they're super derogatory, which try to stray from saying things like that. But I would say I don't really, well, this will probably answer a question that will be asked later, but in general, I don't really like when someone comes up and asks what I am ever, because I'm more than that, and I have all, we all have our personalities, and we're all indigenous, but we're all very different people. So I would say unless an indigenous person is telling you what they are, or there's a situation where race needs to be brought up in the first place, you don't really need to ask, because we kind of know we're a person of color anyway.
Let me just, I want to take more of the scholarly approach here and let you know that in 1924, Indian people were recognized as citizens. And at our tribe in Red Lake, or our nation, we continue to say Red Lake Chippewa because that's what it says in our treaty. But it also says American Indian in our treaties. So in 1924, the National Congress of American Indians said that we need to keep that language in the political sphere, so to speak, so that no one can circumvent our treaties. Many of our tribal groups are there because of those treaties, and so we don't want to lighten that perspective up.
Well, if you're gonna go there, um, I no, I'll save it.
Perhaps we'll get to that later, Don. um, Next question is from a white person, because it says, as a white person, I'm attracted to clothing and home decorations with indigenous themes or styles. Is that offensive or hurtful to you personally or to your culture?
I'm really excited for this question. So, I don't think it's offensive that you want to celebrate and be a part of our culture and our artwork. For me, the biggest thing is if you are going to be buying a painting or some pottery, beadwork, whatnot, that you should really do it in support of our like native work and buy it from somebody who is native and a part of that culture. If you buy it from somebody who doesn't know anything about the culture or practice it, it's appropriation. So that's my thing, is just support the native artists behind that work.
So, okay, again, age probably sets in, but I have three sewing machines, and I sew, and I sew my own regalia. I've sewed it for my kids. I've made them moccasins and things like that. I think the experience over time has been very vast. In fact, I was in Germany once, and this group wanted me to come to their household, and I was like, no way, I'm not going to their household. They were imitating, or rather, uh, they would literally had a group called Bokum Dakota, and so they emulated American Indian people during a certain time and era. So these people did it from 1860 to 1870. So focus. So when I saw pictures, I thought, oh, and I couldn't talk to them, and they were all speaking German. And the principal of the school showed me these pictures, and I thought, well, when the interpreter gets here, he's going to tell me that he went to South Dakota, he went to a powwow. No, this was Bochum, Dakota. These were Germans who were dressed up like Lakota people, dancing at a powwow. And so there's organizations like that, 1,500 of them at that time throughout Europe. And so anyway, I went to their house after the interpreter came. He was a writer for a newspaper. He said, "You got to go." And I said, "Well, why do I got to go?" He says, "Because I want to know why Indians are acting like, or Germans are acting like Indians." And so basically, the idea was about their religion. Socialism kind of stifled their religion, and so they wanted their children to gain an insight about American Indian culture, and so that they could. And so they have these groups all over. They have these powwows and they have these roundups. And people, on the other hand, people dress up like cavalry, but when they come to the powwow, they have to leave their guns in their tents. But anyway, when I got to the house, I looked around and I thought, geez, there's more Indian stuff in this house than any Indian house I've been in my life. And I made the mistake of saying, ooh, that's kind of pretty. And then right away he said, here, this is yours. You get to keep it. And he said it in German. And then when he interpreted it, I just kept making that mistake and saying, oh, that's pretty. So I kind of walked out with arms full of things. But anyway, just a little.
On to the next question here. What is one of the most common microaggressions that you experience that seems to go unnoticed by most people? We'll get to the lighthearted questions later. Anyone want to take that? And it's totally okay if you don't want to take it.
I talk a lot, so I'll probably try to answer everything. I don't know if it's as much of a microaggression, but I graduated from the University of St. Thomas. It might not be any surprise to anyone in this audience, but I look white. So I get away with a lot of things that anyone at this panel might not experience in the real world. So at St. Thomas, and it wasn't a microaggression, it was aggression. I would always get comments about, oh, the natives all up north, they're all alcoholics or they're all drug addicts and useless. And I would just look at their face and, you do know I'm native, right? And then they would constantly backtrack. Well, not all natives, but you just said all natives. So looking the way I do, I think that's the biggest microaggression I could think of, because if they had known I was Native American before they spoke, they would have never said it. And that's really like the biggest one that I come across, is people feel safe and then they let their guard down and say the wrong thing to the wrong person.
So I'd say one of the biggest things is people saying, "You're really pretty for a native person." It's like, who gave you the right to comment on my body without consent? Also, but like, why would that ever be okay? Another thing is, what's the big deal with Redskins? It's an honor, which we've all heard that many a time. And I would say the biggest thing for me is that I'm obsessed with horror movies. I love all things paranormal. I love scary stuff. So naturally, Halloween would be like, Christmas for me. But it's always a struggle to participate in the holiday when people are constantly dressed up as Native Americans. And there's even more of that via social media now, and it's spreading. And so I think that's definitely one of the things is it's a microaggression, but it's difficult to participate in daily activities knowing that your guard always has to be up a little bit. And there was a really good way that someone described a microaggression, and it's like a mosquito bite, and maybe one, like throughout the day, you're okay, it itches, it's fine, but you get 30 to 40 all over your body every single day, and that starts to produce a lot of scars, and it starts to really hurt. So that's kind of how I think of microaggressions.
I'm not going to address microaggressions because there's too many blatant aggressions that happen. So I think I spent most of my adult life trying to help heal our community, overcoming all the policies and all the other things that were put in place to eliminate our culture, our language. Boarding schools. Boarding schools were created for the primary purpose, and the only purpose was to remove our children, educate them in European ways, You take the children, you remove them from the culture, from the language, you educate them to a system that's different than their traditional upbringing, and that's how you break a culture. So microaggressions happen, not to me as a Native American person, but as a person of color. But to me, it's overcoming the purposeful policies and things that this country has done to our people, to either through cultural genocide or just plain genocide. Um, I read somewhere, Gary, you can correct me. I think at the beginning of the 20th century, there were only 225,000 of us left. So they almost succeeded. So our numbers are rebounding, but here in Minnesota, we still make up only 1.8% of the population. So for me, it's the microaggressions pale compared to what this country has done to our people.
Thank you for that, Don. Hey, just a quick reminder for the audience, say keep the murmurs to a minimum, please, because that does get picked up by the camera. And trust me, I've watched it back, and sometimes when you can hear people in the background, it just takes away from the quality. So please just keep that to a minimum, please. Nope. That one's out of my control. Moving on to the next question. Ramsey County is named for Alexander Ramsey. Governor Ramsey, as Minnesota's governor, said, the Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. What can be done to change the name of the county and other public places? Again, just a reminder, please keep the murmurs to a minimum.
Just some of you probably know that in Minneapolis Public Schools, we had a school that was named after Ramsey. It was a middle school in South Minneapolis. Now it's Justice Allen Page. And in fact, I have a group there every week, or rather every other week. And so far this year, Justice Page himself has been there to greet the kids. And so that's kind of a honor for them, and the kids have worked on this themselves. In fact, they had a auditorium where they hosted the specific kids from the grade levels who raised this issue within the school itself, and so it generated over time, and it did take a couple of years, but they got enough support throughout the school, throughout their community, and of course to address that to the school district ultimately, and found that how it was able to move that name to Justice Page because of those very same things, those very issues.
Just real talk, almost every institution and or person that's a historical figure that's on a dollar bill, on a building or anything, has been a white person that has owned a slave or has been a part of some sort of genocide. So not new. But I would say as white people who have access to certain privileges and ways of behaving that won't get them killed or in trouble in the same way that Native people or people of color do, there's a lot of power in changing those names because white people are going to listen to white people. So in terms of changing those things, a lot of that is in white people's hands. And that's not to say that we're not, actively doing things. It's just that if a lot of white people complain about something, it's probably going to get done just a little bit quicker.
Thank you. Thank you, Micah. I want to, you know what, if you don't want to answer this question, just don't, and we'll move on. Someone wrote the question, where did the term Redskins originate? Now, one of the questions I had was about sports teams and mascots. And as we know, there are a lot of different culture or Native cultures that are represented on different sports teams. How do you guys feel about talking about that? Do you want to talk about that? Okay.
So there's quite a few different, there's a baseball team, there's the Blackhawks hockey, and there's Redskins. And the thing that has kind of just caught my attention is like Blackhawks hockey has went as far as asking permission to continue to use that name, and they got the permission. And then they also went and got a native artist to design their uniforms. So they've actually gone that extra step and gone the respectful way, I think. As far as Redskins go, it's basically if um, I don't know if I don't know if I want to touch on the actual term, but for the Redskins team, it's been really hard to grow up with that and have a lot of people that think that it's okay. And what's even harder for me is to see fans that are native of the team and thinking that that's okay too, in that they're trying to like verify or like validate their um, person, and it just hurts me so much that the people think that this is okay to act and make fun of a certain person and a type of people, and they continue to get away with it with absolutely no consequences whatsoever. And we get threatened. We get whenever we say that we don't like this, we're the ones that get arrested when we protest, um, and there's absolutely no solution um, that that they will change. So I don't know if anyone else has any other, but it is very hard. It's and I don't want. Well, I guess it's my son. He's a person, and for him to grow up seeing people and having to do the thing that every day, all day, you have to see this, and people profit off of it, um, and um, then so I think that's the most hurtful thing too, is for them to um, make money off of something that you would give them a day to be native, and they wouldn't. They couldn't handle it. So.
Literally just today in class, we were having a discussion with some of my middle school students, and one of the students asked about the four colors. Why are they these four colors on in our medicine wheel? And I said, so I mean, literally have to go into the foundations of symbolism. And so helping students to know that symbolism is something as a part of all of our cultures and traditions. I might have started with, what's the picture on the side of the U.S. mailbox down on the corner, and they think about it a little bit and they know the colors, and then they know usually that it's an eagle or a bird, or and I start to give them a kind of a foundation of symbolism and how that is a part of our all of our culture. But it doesn't mean this is who we are. And I explained to him that there was a medicine man at Wounded Knee who was a young man, and this is at a time in my life when I was literally I picked up a gun and I held arm. I had an arm. I was ready to die for this cause. I mean, I was a militant, and I've told kids this. I've told teachers this. Um, but and I should tell you real quickly that right now my um, I have grandchildren. I have a wife, family, kids, and so my world is more about agape and rather than being a militant. But at that time, and I can identify when many of the kids discuss about their sisters or brothers who've gone into armed services, and they go into that at the same age that when I became a militant. When you're about 17, 16, 18 years old, you get trained, and my brother did. He was trained to kill, and when he came back from in the military, he knew how to kill people, and I saw his behavior change. But what I'm trying to get at, I think, is that kind of idea was very strong at that time in my life. So to think about what happened in our history and why that particular term was being used, or any other term that was derogatory, um, just kind of made me feel like that's what I'm willing to do. I'm willing to die for this cause, to make a change. And at that time, I think one of the most pre- prevailing books at the time was "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee." So at 17 years old, I was directed by a teacher to read that book, and that would be my escape from social studies class at North High School, and to do a paper on it. And so I cried every night reading that, and I just couldn't believe, how could this happen to our people? How could there be so much horror to us, you know? And so when I think about to this day, when I think about that term, I can. It's kind of that. Unfortunately, it's kind of that microaggression to me. But I'm ready to stand up for it if I need to. My kids, hadn't. I tried to help them avoid that. We were at the protest, the initial protest when when they had the Washington Redskins at the Metrodome, and my daughter was only 6 years old, and she walked in that protest from there down to the Indian Center. It was 20 below zero, and so they know about this concern. And we were in the protest as well at the University of Minnesota recently too, for the same reason, to protest these derogatory terms in our sports or in our lives, I guess.
Thank you for answering that, by the way. I can jump around a little bit. What do you want us to know about Indigenous people?
You know what? I'll probably just pick their brains a little, but you know, I think there's been a couple of authors, and they're not Indians, but one, Jack Weatherford, for instance, educator, teacher at McAllister College. Maybe he's not in here, I hope. Anyway, I know that he wrote Indian Givers, and he wrote a number of other books. And so I kind of I used that when I taught at college level some years ago, and I kind of likened him to kind of the Indiana Jones of Indians. He was able to bring to light things that were remarkable about Indian people, and particularly the life of Indian people before Columbus, so to speak. And for instance, he explained that we were masters of agriculture, we were masters of architecture. We had social structures in our society that were impeccable. We spoke multiple languages. We had medicine people, doctors. We had medicine itself that we had discovered. We invented corn. We were the first ones in the world to have the potato, which got the Europe out of the Dark Ages. So he started to shed the light on that. He started to break down some of what was in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and saying how these leaders, how wonderful they were, how capable they were. The second author that I like to address with my students is Charles Mann. And Charles Mann has just recently come out with a couple of new books, but his first book, 1491, before Columbus, he does a similar kind of thing, but much more thorough. And he explains how they actually were able to genetically alter this plant from a small grass into corn, and the corn has become a staple throughout the world. He explains that there were 368 varieties of potatoes, and he claims one of them was a carnivorous. And so I tell the kids love that. I said, just don't go walking by it. Um, they can't believe it. Anyway, but the tomato, we tell them, we get our kids to understand that these things are a part of our culture. We had cities here that were much more expansive than London or any of the big cities in Europe at the time. There were minimally 60 million people here, and we had so much wonder and awe that it was remarkable. People, and he explains this and all the things. The other thing that struck me was that he said that we were, from his research, and other people have gotten on board, or he's followed other researchers in saying things like the whole Amazon jungle wasn't a jungle. It was, there were plantation like property that had grow specific fruits or vegetables, and nuts, and people harvested that for thousands of years before it became a jungle. It just overgrew. So just remarkable things like that.
So I know it's cheesy, but I think that we're still here. I think we're standing in line behind you at Target. We're on the bus with you. We are next to you getting gas. I think that I actually used to work here in Roseville with the school district, and it was really surprising to me. And I would go to a classroom and say, "Well, you have a Native student in your classroom. You need," and they, "No, I don't." And so even teachers here wouldn't even know that. So if you, there's over like, I think there was like 162 students here in the Roseville School District when I was working here. And a lot of the time you wouldn't know that they were Native. So um, I think that's my thing is that we're still here. We're definitely here, and we're not going anywhere. And so, just to be aware that we don't all have that Native look, and we're your neighbors and we're friends. What do you want?
Um, I think at least what's carried me through my life was understanding who I am spiritually as a Native American. And to me, I think when I talk about certain cultural aspects to the social work students at Metro, I tend to bring up our cultural spiritualness and more about how we believe. Um, so, and I'll use it as an example to show the difference in philosophy, just culturally in philosophy, and philosophies in terms of our spirituality. So, with Christianity, I'll explain that because Christianity has always been used as that softening tool to colonize people throughout the world. But here, this Christian belief of it was your God-given right to have dominion over the plants, the animals, and everything else within it, framed under this term called manifest destiny. That it was your God-given right to take this land from us and to do away with us for some reason. In our spirituality, we believe that we're no better or no worse than everything around us. The plants, the animals, come from this Mother Earth, and we return to this Mother Earth. So when you have a philosophical spirituality that encompasses everything around you, and that you give thanks to everything that sustains your life, um, to this Mother Earth that is here before us, will be here after us. So in our, in that spiritual belief, how can one own something that is here, will always be here, and will be here to nourish you? So those two different philosophies clashed, and I think that because I know stories that I've heard, when our elders would listen to Christians talk about Christianity, we would sit and listen, and then when they were done, we would acknowledge what they had said. Then when we tried to share our stories about who we were shut down. And we couldn't understand why, if we listened to you, why you couldn't listen to us.
Thank you. We'll go with this one because it's a little lighthearted. Um, what is your favorite tradition, food, or attribute of your nation or family?
So I'm gonna start with the food because I haven't had dinner yet. My favorite food, and I think it might be very common, is fry bread. And for me, it's just like it was kind of a rite of passage when my mom taught me how to make it. And now I surpassed her in the quality of my fry bread, so I get bragging rights. For me, I didn't actually learn the history of fry bread until like a year ago, and so it kind of sucks saying that that's my favorite food when it ultimately rooted in our oppression and colonization, but it's so good. And ultimately, I think every culture has some variation of fry bread as well. So nothing like Indian tacos.
Yeah, I kind of have to go along probably with the meat. Um, so Menominees are really big in hunting and fishing. I don't know if you know, we're in Wisconsin, kind of closer over by Green Bay. So even today, my dad went and got some venison for us today. He got a buck today, so yay! And so yeah, definitely venison and probably berries. If you go onto the Menominee Reservation, there's a lot of wild berries. So uh, um, those berries are way better than store bought.
I like steak.
Okay. So, love all the food. I would say one of the biggest things, especially coming from the Pine Ridge Reservation, where 90% live in poverty, a lot of it was about being together as a family, um, and not having a whole lot with that. So, my best memories and the stuff that I like, that I crave, are hearing drum beats. There's always something whenever I can hear a drum beat that centers me, that makes me feel like this. Yeah, there's something that's finally there. It's sort of this way that I can rebalance myself is when I hear that, or if I'm in a sweat lodge, which is sort of just like this ultimate way that I can gather and make sense of things. So the food, yes, but I think definitely the music, the noise of drum beats. It's something that's like primally there for thousands of years. It's some like deep rooted stuff that kind of goes back for generations.
So I think.
I'm
Go ahead.
I'm gonna get a little serious with this. Um, I think part of the difficulty of answering questions like that is I'm a storyteller. All right, so I'm gonna tell you a story. So when I was 10 years old, I spent the summer with my grandfather and my great grandmother. My great grandmother didn't speak English. My grandfather did, um, but at 10, he would take me out, and I learned how to pick blueberries, choke cherries. Um, if there was a berry somewhere, he knew where it was at, and we would pick it. He would take me out, and we would walk through the fields, walk through the forest. We'd come on these streams, and eventually I figured out we were checking his traps. So that summer, I stayed with my great grandmother, and all the meat is brown, right? It's just fried in a pan, nothing special. A little salt, pepper. There might be some boiled potatoes. We'd be lucky if we had some fried bread. Usually it was Wonder Bread, or some other kind of commodity, which is another whole story. So that summer, I ate this brown meat, thinking that I was eating deer meat, venison. Well, my grandfather would ask me, oh, he nicknamed me Mukwa. And Mukwa in our language means bear. One day I was in the front yard, there was a pine tree there, and I had an itch in the middle of my back that I couldn't reach. So I was scratching my back on the tree, so he nicknamed me Mukwa. So he'd say, Mukwa, would I eat beaver? And I'd tell him, nah, I'm born in the city. Bologna, salami, two pieces of bread. I'd tell him no. A couple of days later, he'd ask me if I'd eat muskrat. And again, I'd tell him no. Rabbit, I didn't mind. Rabbit was good. I like rabbit. It took me a while to realize that he was asking me after I ate it. So not only were we checking those traps, he was bringing that food home, and that's what we were eating. That is a traditional. We're hunters and gatherers. We ate what we got from the earth. We ate what we got from the forest. When you're born and raised in the city, that becomes foreign to you. And so many of us have lost that connection. Many folks on reservations, we were raised on commodities, foods that were provided by the federal government in their fiduciary responsibility. And taking our land, they were to supply us with housing, food, and they did so, but they did so on a bare minimum level, which has helped increase diabetes in our communities because of the food that we were fed through the federal government. So that question in and of itself has a deep, deep history between us, the United States, and this country.
Right on. Thank you. So, on a lighter note, no, I'm kidding. Actually, I thought the question gave us some latitude, and I was thinking about humor to begin with, and a good friend of mine said out loud to a group, said that, what do you call an Indian who can't hunt? And then nobody knew, of course, and she said, well, a vegetarian. And so I thought, well, I kind of thought that was mean. I thought she knew that I probably, that's my choice, a vegetarian or vegan. Raising 3 kids, and 2 of them, literally, this is my life. I'm gonna eat vegan or vegetarian. And I think that's, that was fine. And I know that there's a point in my life where it was obvious that something had to change in my own eating habits. Grandfather passed away, heart disease. Mother, father, heart disease, diabetes. Sisters, failure in kidney or liver. And these conditions that surrounded me, and not just my immediate family, but my extended family. And so those kinds of things. But even though we faced those issues, there was always a bit of humor throughout our lives at our table. And so even with my more immediate family now, my kids and my grandchildren and their loved ones, we probably choose a bit vegetarian or vegan. In fact, I got to tell you, you guys, if you haven't tried this, go to White Castle and have an Impossible Burger. So if you don't know about this, this is a scientist out of Stanford who he wanted to figure out how come that meat is so delicious. So he separated that particular DNA of that and produced it in vegetable form. And so he uses primarily beets. But this is an Impossible Burger. It's sold at different stores, Whole Foods, but it's vegan.
Thanks, you guys. Please talk about the Americanization of Thanksgiving and/or Columbus Day. Guess that's timely since Thanksgiving's next week. Oh yeah, yeah.
People started here, but I was we opened 4 Winds in South Minneapolis, a Native American magnet school, American Indian magnet school. Interestingly, it was at Mount Sinai Hospital, and when they sold it to the district, Minneapolis Public Schools had to keep their name in whatever school they built. So we were the Mount Sinai American Indian magnet school, which is interesting. But we had made some decisions back when we opened it in 1990. We were open for just about 12 years, I think, and um, I was a teacher there. But one of the first challenges was that issue, and how are we going to deal with these kind of things in our school? We did a great deal of research. There are people writing about, the what the real Thanksgiving was, which was atrocious, and we couldn't teach our third graders or our kids that insight. So we had to really kind of mellow it out, and we kind of taught our kids about the seasons. And so fall was a harvest time, and in our tradition, it was an amazing venture that we were preparing for through winter. We wanted to get through winter. We didn't want to get consumed by the Wendigo, which is a bad spirit in the winter. If you don't have enough food, that could happen. There's some stories behind that. But yeah, we did not bring that into our curriculum the way it is in the mainstream, I suppose. We did not tell the kids that it was a dinner at the beginning of the beginning of these states that were coming together in the United States and all that. We talked about our seasons and tried to avoid that. Well, it worked okay.
Well, growing up in the schools, I guess it was always, this is in the 80s. I didn't want to say my age, but so I really just kind of went along with everything because I thought it was a happy time because we got off of school, right? And everybody's really, really likes that. But then you kind of go on to understand really what happened and the fact that Thanksgiving really didn't never really truly occurred. When you find that out, it was actually something during the Civil War times that they just wanted to um, have a good kind of like folk tale and the happiness of the creation of the pilgrims arriving, and there was no belt buckles, there was no anything like that. I think it's really important for us to let our children know, our students know the reality of the situation. That they say, "Oh no, 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 that's too much." No, you should see the video games that kids are playing now. They can handle the truth of what actually happened and the fact that there was really no Thanksgiving. There was the the pilgrims were there and they got like 5 deer, I think it was really what happened, and they were shooting off guns to warn the Indians away that were living across the river, and like there truly was no feast. They were eating venison, there was no turkeys. So I think just being honest, I really as far as Thanksgiving goes, and I think it's really hard as far as like Columbus Day goes. He's it's everywhere, and he was a malicious, horrible person. And for that, I just recently, I don't know if everyone knows that in LA, they just took down the Columbus Day statue, and it's been this huge movement and this huge ask for, I think it was like 20 some years they've been asking for this statue to be taken down. And I think that is just um, something like that should just be a given and taken down as soon as it's something that we constantly have to fight for and ask for. And Minnesota is, I think, progressive in a lot of ways in having that Indigenous Peoples Day, but you don't see anyone else really celebrating it other than Indigenous people. I don't see, there's no one at Target saying, "Oh, happy Indigenous Peoples Day," like "Happy 4th of July, Merry Christmas." They say all these other things, but they don't say that. But, so it's like always this other kind of like forgotten thing that happens. Um, but as far as holidays go, it's really, really just hard on Thanksgiving. I think a lot of people. I don't know if there's a blog that's really Debbie Reese. She does like a Native American literature blog, And one of the things that she writes about Thanksgiving is like, oh, well, you celebrate it, you go to the movies, you eat. And she's like, everything's closed. There's nothing else to do but stay home with your family and eat. Like, or I mean, so it's a forced holiday. Like, everyone gets that day, everything is closed. And so it's not like we're intentionally going out and celebrating the pilgrims and the natives. And so you kind of have to look through a different lens at the actual holiday. So
So I just wanted to say that one of the important things with Americanized holidays in general is that you kind of have to ask yourself, who is this holiday really for, and what kind of people are actually celebrating this holiday. So my family has never celebrated Thanksgiving. We've never celebrated Christmas, because Christmas is actually around the time where the Wounded Knee Massacre happened. And it was kind of like the last taming of the Sioux. I think that's what it was called at one point. But Thanksgiving is, my whole family's like into activism, and so anytime I am in front of a large group of white people that are willing to listen, I'm like, here's what you can do. So one of the things is that, and what I would appreciate is that you know the history of what you're celebrating. You know that 100 million Native Americans were massacred, they raped, murdered, killed. It was an extermination. And to celebrate Thanksgiving as though it were a peaceful dinner is like saying that during the Holocaust, the Germans asked the Jews to go stay at a hotel for a little while, and they decided to stay away. It's glossing over pain, anger, all of these things, and then it's forcing people whose families were a part of that, who live with that historical trauma every day, to celebrate it and to go along with this fictitious lie, because it's better to go along with it than fight against it. So I would say with any holiday, especially a lot of them, but Thanksgiving, it's a chance for you to all talk with your family and to research what actually happened, and to say, hey, mom, dad, kids, do you know what happened in this? Do you know what went down? Sort of change the narrative of what you're celebrating, and maybe make it a chance to donate to some Native American funds or take action in a way that you haven't before.
Trying to be respectful, but sometimes those questions are microaggressions.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm not going to do the follow-up for that. Then I'm going to just skip over that. I want to jump back for a second. So this event started at 6:30 this evening, but prior to this event at 6 o'clock, Gary led a smudging ceremony outside here, off of the children's area. Can you talk a little bit about that? That's not one of the questions. I just want to address it because you did do it.
So, this is actually something that I do with my students in every school that I go to. And what I've been trying to give kids understanding of is traditions and our heritage. I want them to understand that they have a deep their own domain of history in their culture, and so this ceremony that we celebrate is a smudging, and we burn sage. Um, so I'm maybe mixing a couple of stories, but the primary example that I want my kids to understand is that when the Creator came to give this gift to the world, all of the creatures came to the meeting and said they wanted it. They wanted to. He listened to each of them, the four-leggeds, the winged creatures, even the grasses and the winds, and they all vied for this gift, so they could communicate to the Creator. And the Creator said that, no, well, I'm gonna give this to the human beings, not because they're any better than all of you, but because they're the neediest. And so every time that the human beings we light this fire, and the smoke rises, it's a signal, it's a symbolic, again, the perspective that our prayers and our thoughts are in that smoke, and it's going to the Creator, and so the Creator will listen to us. And so we shared that, and each of us we pull the smoke into our heart, and we pull it over our minds so that what's in our heart and our minds come out in our meeting. But we also wash with it, and you got to understand that this is a whole different thinking, a whole different way of life. So people washing with smoke or was just it's just not something anybody really comprehends, I suppose, unless perhaps in some other religions too. But just the fact that we have our own religion in all of our different nations or tribes is unique and understanding. So we get a little understanding of that. So I brought a conch shell and some sage, and we did that this before we came in. And we do it in a circle. We had a few people who joined us as well.
Thank you for that, Gary. Don, I want to give you the opportunity because you did take issue that the smudging ceremony didn't happen within the space we were going to be. It's up to you, but this is the opportunity to share why that's important.
Okay. Um, so the fact that Gary and the rest of them had to go outside to smudge is one of the ongoing issues we face as Native Americans in practicing our spirituality. So the fact that Ramsey County Public Library wouldn't allow that smudging to happen here in this room. Usually when we perform that, it's to clean, to put us in a good space, to put us in a good mood. It's to help purify and welcome everyone. And the fact that we weren't allowed to do it here is part of the problem. And it's what we've dealt with as American Indians, Native Americans, Indigenous, Anishinaabe, Lakota, Dakota, people in our entire life. So even in an attempt to have this dialogue, we were denied our basic right. So what Gary had alluded to earlier is that there was a what they call what you're taught, what we were all taught in school, is that the last great battle between the United States and the Lakota was at Wounded Knee in 1890. When in fact it was a gathering of people practicing the ghost dance in hopes of having a ceremony that would bring their ancestors back and strengthen the people. The remains of the 7th Cavalry were brought in. They claim they don't know who fired the first shot, but since they had collected all the guns from the American Indians, anyways, they ended up massacring about 200-300 people. But the fact that they were gathered practicing their spirituality scared the federal government so that were the only group in the United States that our spirituality was outlawed. We couldn't practice our practice. We couldn't practice our spirituality here in a country that was set up under freedom, religious freedom. Because that's what I was taught in school. You guys came over here because you were persecuted in England and you couldn't practice your religion, so you came here. That right wasn't returned to us to 1978. So that was, 5-6 years after Gary and I graduated from high school before we legally could even smudge, let alone do any of these other things. So the battle is still going on. So I was saddened. I mean, I was happy that they were able to smudge, but I was saddened that they had to do it outside.
So just to kind of follow up what each of them said is, so working at Hennepin County Libraries, we actually had to go through this huge, long process of being able to smudge. They're very worried about the fire alarms and everything else, and they had to go through and test everything to make sure it wouldn't be, facilities was there. It was this huge, long process, but if that's what needs to be done, that's what needs to be done. So Ramsey County Libraries can go ahead and start their own facilities and that sort of thing to get it done. But it's always our job to do this stuff. So it really would be nice to have some support, and it's not always us having to do that sort of thing. And then just to follow up on smudging, like, and working in Roseville School District, I was doing the same thing with my students and having them smudge. And we are also have to be outside. So the school board makes us go outside, which I'm sorry, but it is cold out. We're in Minnesota, and so having to take students outside when it's winter, it's very disconcerting that the school board is okay with this, when it would be okay to do this inside. And then just we're coming in. I had a group of students outside at the high school, and we're coming inside, and one of the teachers is like, "What are you guys doing out there? Are you smoking weed?" And it's like, so even now, another educator to educator, there is this disrespect in that she knew it wasn't weed. I mean, it's very distinctly different from smoking weed, and it's just that kind of thing that continues to happen even in your own community. And they're still making us go outside. And then even now, um, just to talk about appropriation, Sephora right now is having, I don't know if you guys know about this, but they're having a witches kit. And so you can get a feather in there, and you can get some sage, and so they even are taking our religion that we weren't even allowed and now profiting off of that. And when you bring it to their attention, we're just dismissed. So just a little follow-up.
Wow, you've given us so much to. I can't wait to watch this back. Um, Switching gears a little bit, what is the graduation rate for Native Americans, and how does that compare to other kids of color? Anyone know?
So while I worked the 3 years that I worked here, all of the students graduated. My Native students, all of them graduated. So it was 100% here in Roseville. We only had, I think the last graduation we had 3, and the year before we had 5. So I mean, there is very few that are going, but it was 100%. So
Yeah, I think the statistics are probably real evident. There was a time when this could be on the top of my head, but I think what my work is doing is trying to work them into high school. We have uh, uh, counselors who work with them at 8th grade, transitioning into 9th grade into high school. American Indian, our Indian Education Department. So we're trying to do that. I think we're at about 68, maybe 80% of our kids graduating. There are 100%. I know in uh, a good colleague of mine who is out in west of us in one of the suburbs, 100%. And again, they do a lot of things for the kids throughout their career, keep them engaged with their families involved in as well. Um, those are the things that help happen. But you know, I think the challenges in the city are sometimes different. I think our kids they see a lot of opportunity to just be kids, you know, and sometimes in a more rambunctious way, I suppose, or difficult way. And so they have challenges that they are dealing with, but not any less smart. And sometimes it'll take them more years, and they'll get through that. But again, I think that's, it's kind of a relative sense, I suppose. But we have been increasing our educational um, graduation rate in Minneapolis over the years that I've been doing what I do.
I can't pull the exact number off. I'm trying to go by memory. But our graduation rates still are worse than other communities of color. Um, and while I think efforts that, through Indian education and all that has helped, um, we're still overcoming the negative impact of boarding schools. And so, but graduation rates for American Indians, off the top of my head, were still, the last figure I remember seeing was falling in the 50 percentile somewhere, between 50 and 60%. And it's generally worse than African American or other communities of color. So um, it's still an issue, an ongoing issue. Part of it is that so questions about Thanksgiving, questions about Columbus Day, questions about these things. When you're brought up, I'm a product of Minneapolis Public Schools. I was brought up and taught and educated lies that later, as an adult, I had to uneducate and unlearn. And so all of us were lied to. We weren't given the truth of what actually happened in this country. We weren't told what actually happened. We were lied to. And so, a story I like to share, and some of you may remember this, is my freshman year at Macalester College. I was taking an early American history class, and we were studying this utopian community called Oneida, which was being created in about the early 1600s by Puritans who had come over, again, for their religious freedom. And they were setting up this utopian community. And after the second day in class, I asked my professor how we could study this time period and not talk about the people who were there first. And her response to me, while it sounds harsh, was the most honest thing an educator had ever told me. And she said, "We study history from the point of view of those who conquered and not those who were vanquished." So if I wanted to learn about American Indians, I needed to take an American Indian class. Well, this was 1972 at Macalester. They didn't offer American Indian at that time. So you were damned if you do and damned if you don't. But I just share those stories because those are the things that we are all overcoming. Not just us as Indigenous people, but you also, because the education you were provided didn't tell you the truth, didn't tell you why we don't, what is Thanksgiving. It was made up to make you guys feel good. It wasn't made up for us, but they lied to all of us. I guess that's all I'm trying to share.
So one thing I just wanted to add is I went to Four Winds, where Gary here taught. When I was in school, I think each class had about 30 kids apiece, and I think there were 3 teachers for my grade, so about 90 kids of our graduating class. When I graduated from high school, Minneapolis Public Schools, I'm sure they do it every year, but they invite any Indigenous student graduating to a formal dinner, and they give you a feather to carry on your journey, and they kind of congratulate you for making it that far. When I went to this dinner, I think it's safe to say most of the students at that dinner had gone to Four Winds with me. So I seen a lot of kids that I had grown up with. There were 18 kids there. So out of 90, 18 of us had graduated. When I went to college at St. Thomas, there was one other Indigenous student there with me. I think a lot of Indigenous students who do go on to college go to the University of Minnesota because they do have a far better program than any college here. And because I didn't go there, I wasn't really like introduced into that or see how many kids at the U of M are enrolled in that program and are Indigenous as well. But the number is very small. On top of the factors of not learning our culture, I think one of the biggest things is just all the external factors we have to face. When you grow up in the projects, that's not a safe area. Sometimes, it can be hard to get to school. Mom and dad work late. I miss the bus. Now I can't go to school. Nobody there to walk me. There's all kinds of things. If the father's taken out of the home or arrested, put in prison, that kind of rips apart our families as well. And so, on top of just trying to get good grades and graduate and do what a student does, we have to deal with all these real world issues that are bombarding us every single day and kind of beat down our spirit. I think the uptick in seeing students graduate who are Indigenous kind of just speaks to our resiliency. And I guess Peggy Flanagan said it today, when something gets thrown at us, we just keep working and we try to overcome it. And I think we've seen a huge uptick of that in the last since I've graduated high school.
don't know if this really like goes along with it, but even working in the school district for so long, not even Roseville, but I worked at MPS too for a while. It's very hard for me to. I personally don't care about high school numbers. I really don't. Like, I'm gonna care more if my son knows how to hunt or he knows his stories or his songs. And I think that we are still, and I don't know why it's okay to ask a child to sit for 8 hours a day or whatever it is. Like, this is like, I don't, so I really have a hard time even like, I think with the questions, just like, why is this even a priority for us? Um, so I understand like we need to be able to read and be successful, but there are different ways that we view success. So a lot of times I was dealing with a child, oh, they had to stay home because the parent had to go to work and the younger student, like the younger sibling, was sick, so they had to stay home and watch. But that's our community. That's how we raise. And like I would get calls, oh, they've missed like 6 days in a row, and um, but they were home watching grandma because she was ill. So there are priorities that are different for I believe for our community. And so even that question, I understand that it, you know, the the non-native community is very into numbers and that sort of thing. But I think we have a different view of success.
Just quickly, at the last part of her discussion was, or her voice was that accountability issue. And, you know, as a administrator for a number of years, that was something that we focused on a lot as our role as a principal in the public schools. And we had to be accountable to the people who gave us the money to raise or to teach our kids. And it was always, you know, something on our mind to keep in mind. Our teachers didn't always do that. I mean, I didn't tell them this is what you got to do like that. I mean, I was pretty diplomatic, but anyway, accountability is a big issue.
All right. Again, I'm a stickler for time, so with less than 10 minutes left, I'm not going to get to the rest of these questions. So be mad at me. Don't be mad at them. Um, I I also want to be careful and tiptoe around like not asking triggering questions. As a person of color, I understand what that's like, and so I there's some questions that I want to avoid there. But I do have two things that I want to kind of end on. Because it's something that's frankly it's something that's in the news. I think you probably know what I'm going to ask, and I've got three cards on it. The camp or the tent community on Franklin and Hiawatha. What suggestions might you have to help those living in the encampment, short term or long term, um, or that community?
I'll jump in on this by not answering that question directly. Um, I'm sorry. So to me, when I look at that encampment, what I'm seeing is the tail end result of the policies that were put in place, from the boarding schools to taking our land to everything that has been done to our people. That is what you're seeing at Hiawatha is the end result. Those policies were successful. All right. My mother was a product of the boarding schools because of her experience of going to Pipestone Boarding School in Minnesota and then Flandreau in South Dakota, is that when she was raising us and we asked her to teach us our language, she told us no, that you have to learn English. That was an impact of the boarding school. Um, you go through a generation of that, one or two generations of your children being removed. They're not taught their traditional ways. They're not taught how who they are as a Anishinaabe or a Lakota, Dakota, and you're raised in an institution. You're not taught how to parent. You're not taught how to love. You're not taught how to care for one another. That gets passed down. I consulted for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration when I was director of the Chemical Health Division for the state of Minnesota. And I was asked to visit 5 reservations throughout the United States to help those tribes look at addressing co-occurring issues, mental health and substance abuse. What shocked me was every reservation I visited, they were all in the same place. In Wyoming, Montana, South Dakota, no matter where I went, every tribe was dealing with the same issues. They were down to very few natural speakers. Drugs and alcohol were issues on those reservations. So as I looked across the country, I realized that the federal government was successful with those policies, and our people are recovering from that. So when I look at that encampment, I see the end result of the policies put in place to supposedly the effort was to assimilate us into the dominant culture. Well, that didn't work. I mean, we're still here. But you're seeing the end result of what those policies were. So I couldn't, I'm sorry, I couldn't address that without talking about that first, because that is never discussed and that has never come up. What I have heard are news reports on how there have been about 4 or 5 heroin deaths. I even saw a news report where they were talking about the divisiveness between people who were coming down and providing food and clothing. And they were actually covering a story that we're talking about this division in the camp itself. And again, it's the same tactics. It's this not addressing why they're there in the first place, blaming them for being there, and then creating this divisiveness with the group that's there. And I know my wife is here, and she can attest to this because whenever I watch these news programs, I'm just hollering at the TV. It just drives me nuts because they're not getting to the root of the problem, and it just drives me nuts. Shut up.
So just real quickly, one story that I show my students is from it's called Watching the Hawks, and it's Jesse Ventura's son is the newscaster, and one of his colleagues comes to Minneapolis just about mid-October and does some interviews with some leaders in our community. The CEO of Native American Community Clinic, who explains, how we're trying to help the families in the medical and areas get resources. She also interviews people and finds out about Red Lake Nation and the land that they own across the street in Hiawatha, and they're demolishing it and going to put FEMA housing there for the people. They talk to the leader of the American Indian movement in our community, and he explains, how, just like what Don is saying, this is kind of an issue that we've been trying to deal with other leaders. And so I think the remarkable thing is that all of our kids know this as Tent City. And I'm trying to say to them, the politically correct term is the Wall of Forgotten Natives. And in the Circle newspaper, they published back in late August, I think, or September, they talked about a family, one woman who left her job in Seattle and she was making $30 an hour. Her sister called and said they got to amputate my foot, and so she said, I'm coming out there and bringing my daughter. So she gave up that job, came here, ended up at Tent City with her sister, and got through that operation. She got a house. She got some space at St. Mary's or Mary's Place, and then was helped out of Mary's Place into an apartment. And within about a month or 2 months, she still goes back there to tell people that there's ways to get out. There's some hope, aside from the issues and when the woman, so anyway, watching the Hawks.
So, Michael, okay, all right. So just, my my library that I work out of is just a few, like a block and a half from the encampment. And so we were driving, I was driving with my niece, and probably will cry again. But I was driving with my niece, and this is when like a few tents were just going up, and she's like, "Oh, Auntie, look, they have somewhere to live now." And even this 5-year-old child knew that, that they, and they've created a community there. And this is something that was taken from us. And even the mayor coming out, and I think the history of Minneapolis or the Twin Cities itself, you really have to look at the history and the what Don was saying. And we were on, so they were on we were on reservations, and we had no food, we had nowhere to live, and given absolutely nothing that was promised, and we couldn't leave the reservation. It was against the law. We would be killed if we left the reservation. So then the government comes to us and says, "Well, you can relocate, and we will give you a job in the cities. So if you leave your reservation, we'll give you a job." What do as a parent, what would you do? Of course, you're going to leave and take the job, right? But you were told that you could no longer be an enrolled member of your nation. So they come and they get the job in the railroad, and they have to denounce their person. And actually, a lot of resident natives here in Roseville have this, where um, they talk about their grandparents were relocated here, and they know they're Ojibwe, but they don't know what band or reservation. They know absolutely nothing. They just know they're Ojibwe. And so this is what's happening. And the fact that when they get here, they have no housing whatsoever. And then they go to the Social Security office and they get a check for housing. But do they get decent housing? No. You will call, and there's stories. You can welcome to come to the library and check it out. But there are stories that say they will call for an interview to go check out an apartment. They go there, they see that they're native, and they said, "Oh no, it got taken already." So then they end up in housing. This is the history of Minneapolis. They end up in these houses with no doors, no windows, no heat, no running water. And this is the history. And so we've had some poor housing. And now it's come to the heightened part of it all, and that we can't afford and to even be within where you wanted us to be, relocated to the cities. We're here now, and we can't even afford to be here, which has become our home. So I think that recognizing the history behind all this, and yes, there are drugs, yes, there are things that were introduced to us to make sure that we were able to assimilate. And we didn't have alcohol, we didn't have all these things that were given to us, and so we would sign the treaties and that sort of thing. So I think we really have to recognize what led us to this point. And if we had a choice, would we be living in a tent? No. But they have created a community. They were living individually everywhere. And now you go and you talk to people that live there, and they're like, "Well, I want to stay next to them. They're my family now." And this is our way of living, in that we are our community. We tend to live with our grandparents, and if you um, uh, ask anyone, you always kind of know where your grandparents are, your parents are. We're very communal living. So, and then that's what they're now asking for in the creation of the shelters is we're asking the encampment, like, what would you want to see in your future housing? And they're like, "Well, we would really like it if it was like a kitchen for all of us to use, so we could continue to eat together." And that's just our way. And so, if anything, I and there are other people other than natives living there too. So recognize that fact that homelessness is a huge issue. There's encampments in St. Paul. So it has, I think, to highlight this as a native issue. Yeah, I mean, sure, but I think we have to recognize the role that was played in, and so that's just what I have.
So what's already been said, I think, is really good. To answer the question and what you guys can do, for me, it's pay attention to politics, listen to people of color, including Indigenous people, and make the right choices when you're at the voting booth. In 2016, I followed, well, in 2017, I followed the Nikema Levy Pounds campaign very closely. I listened to everything she was saying against Jacob Fry, and people still voted for him. And once he was elected as mayor and all the glorious things he promised, he still refused to admit that there was even a homeless problem. This is going back to even June of this year when I decided to file for council, because I would listen to people say nonstop, go to his office, just demand that he do something about the homeless problem. And he says, we have staff working on it, or I wasn't aware that there was an issue. And that really just grinded my gears. And I figured if there's nothing Minneapolis is willing to do, maybe I can make a difference in Roseville. For the camp at that point was only 3-4 tents. It was still very small. And then it just had exponentially grew from there. I think a lot of people vote from a point of privilege, and they don't realize that policy is made without our consent, without us giving back information, and it's always made out of a place of ignorance because they were fed these lies in school, like Don mentioned, and they, like Micah mentioned as well. It's very hard to re-educate people when they don't want to listen to you. They shut you down. They don't believe what you're saying, and they want to believe that they're the good guy. At a certain point, it's either you need to support these people, you need to support us in trying to push for policy change, or actively become somebody who can make policy change, because we're pretty powerless in a certain respect, like Micah said. And so it's really important that you guys be our allies in this fight and come without judgment and look at why people might have a heroin addiction, and realize that we need resources that embrace our culture and help us heal using our culture. One of the biggest things with addiction in our community's healing is that it's done without our culture. And so it just sets us up on a road of failure again when we don't recognize how we can heal and how we've healed in past generations.
Yeah, homelessness has been a really big thing for a very long time, and the irony of the situation of Native American homelessness is it's like overbearing. It's like a skunk in your face. Um, but I would just say that you all have resources, you all have tools, you can find out ways to help the Indigenous community, to help what's happening with homelessness. There are people you can reach out to. There are Facebook groups. There are people that are getting donations to the camps. There are ways that you can call, like Dana said, all of your policymakers. There are ways that you can enact change and make a difference, and I think that's important. And also, it's important to realize that, like every Native person on this panel, just existing in general for all of us and every day-to-day thing that we do is an act of resistance and is triumph, because our people were 100% literally exterminated. Like the end goal of all American policies was to get rid of us. You know, our water is being poisoned right now. Suicide rates for Native Americans are through the roof. Addiction, missing and murdered Indigenous women that are sold into sex trafficking, fetal abduction, children taken from our bodies. Every point in our life, we've had to face resistance and face some sort of way that people are trying to kill us off. So I just also want to say that, and want to say that I'm super excited that we're here and that I was on a panel with all these people, because everyone here is doing amazing things, and every day is a battle.
Thank you so much, Micah. Can I have everybody stand, please? We already took our photo, so it's not for a photo. Give these folks a round of applause. I am incredibly in awe of all of you. Thank you so much. I feel like I've made a new friend in all of you. It has been my absolute honor being a part of this series and having you be a part of it. And we're just going to end there. So thank you so much. Have a great night.